After Germany's defeat in the First World War, the German people did not feel as if they had merely lost a military conflict. They felt as if the entire world had collapsed upon them. The empire was gone. The Kaiser had stepped down. The old order, which had ruled for generations, disappeared almost overnight. In its place came a new political system, a fragile democracy known as the Weimar Republic. But from the beginning, millions of Germans did not trust it. To them, this new republic did not represent hope. It represented defeat. It represented surrender. It represented humiliation. And then came the Treaty of Versailles, a peace agreement on paper, a wound in the hearts of millions. The treaty blamed Germany for the war. It forced the country to pay enormous reparations, took away territory, colonies, military power, and national pride. For many Germans, Versailles was not seen as justice. It was seen as punishment. A nation that had once viewed itself as powerful, disciplined, and destined for greatness was now broken, disarmed, and forced to kneel before its enemies. Over time, defeat became anger. Anger became resentment, and resentment became a hunger for revenge. In homes, cafes, factories, and military barracks, people asked the same questions. How did this happen? Who betrayed us? How did a great nation fall so low? Then the economy began to collapse. Prices rose at terrifying speed. The German currency lost value almost by the hour. People carried bags, baskets, and even wheelbarrows full of banknotes just to buy bread. A lifetime of savings disappeared in days. A monthly wage became worthless before it could be spent. Money became paper. Security became memory. The middle class, once proud and stable, watched its life's work dissolve into nothing. And in the streets, violence grew. Communists fought nationalists. Paramilitary groups fought each other. Police struggled to control cities filled with anger and fear. Every side claimed to be the only force capable of saving Germany. Most ordinary people did not understand every detail of politics. But they understood one thing very clearly. Their lives were getting worse, and no one in power seemed able to stop it. This is the question at the heart of the story. How can a wounded, exhausted, angry society open the door to one man, believe he is its savior, and only later discover that it has handed him the keys to one of the darkest nightmares in human history? This is not only the story of Adolf Hitler. It is the story of a nation in crisis, a democracy under attack, people searching for simple answers, and a leader who understood how to turn fear into power. Germany after the First World War was a country living between memory and ruin. Only a few years earlier, it had been an empire with one of the strongest armies in Europe. Its people had been told they were fighting for honor, survival, and national destiny. Then suddenly the war was over. The soldiers returned from the front. But they did not return to victory parades. They returned to hunger, unemployment, political chaos, and national shame. The Weimar Republic, born in the aftermath of defeat, carried the burden of a war it had not started and a peace treaty it had been forced to accept. To many Germans, the politicians of the new republic were not leaders. They were the men who had signed the humiliation. In reality, Germany's military situation in 1918 was desperate. Its allies had collapsed. Its army was exhausted. Its economy was strained beyond repair. But reality is often less powerful than myth. And in post-war Germany, one myth became especially dangerous. The myth of the stab in the back. It claimed that the German army had not truly been defeated on the battlefield. It claimed that brave soldiers at the front had been betrayed by politicians, revolutionaries, leftists, and Jews at home. This idea was false, but it was emotionally powerful. It allowed millions of Germans to avoid the painful truth of defeat. It told them they had not failed. They had been betrayed. And this was exactly the kind of story Adolf Hitler would later use with devastating effect. Because people in pain often do not want complicated explanations. They want a name. They want a face. They want someone to blame. The Weimar Republic struggled to survive in a country where both the far left and the far right wanted to destroy it. Communists dreamed of revolution. inspired by what had happened in Russia. Right-wing nationalists dreamed of restoring order through authoritarian rule. In the middle stood democracy, weak, unpopular, and blamed for almost everything. Then came hyperinflation. In 1923, the German mark collapsed almost completely. People were paid twice a day, then rushed to shops before prices rose again. Workers carried wages in bundles. Children played with stacks of worthless money. Families burned banknotes for heat because the paper was worth more as fuel than as currency. For ordinary Germans, this was not an economic event. It was a psychological collapse. It destroyed trust. Trust in money. Trust in government. Trust in the future. And once people stop trusting the future, they become vulnerable to anyone who promises to rebuild it. In this atmosphere, extreme voices grew louder. They did not speak of compromise. They spoke of revenge. They did not speak of patience. They spoke of action. They did not speak of democracy. They spoke of strength. And slowly, the idea of a strong leader began to seduce a wounded nation. A leader who would not argue. A leader who would not compromise. A leader who would punish enemies, restore pride, and make Germany feared again. That leader had not yet fully arrived. But the conditions that would make him possible were already forming. Adolf Hitler was not born a dictator. He was born in 1889 in the town of Braunau am Inn, near the border between Austria and Germany. His family was not noble. His childhood was not extraordinary. His father, Alois Hitler, was a customs official. Strict, authoritarian, and often harsh, he expected obedience. He was quick to anger and, according to many accounts, violent at home. His mother, Clara, was very different. She was gentle, protective, and deeply devoted to her son. Between the harshness of the father and the tenderness of the mother, the young Hitler grew up with a distorted relationship to power. He feared authority, but he also admired it. He saw that force could impose silence. He saw that weakness was ignored. These early lessons did not create the dictator by themselves, but they helped shape a personality that would later worship strength and despise vulnerability. At school, Hitler was not a brilliant student, but he was deeply influenced by stories of German history, German nationalism, and German destiny. One teacher in particular, Leopold Poch, left a mark on him. He spoke passionately about the German people, about national unity, and about the idea that Germans had been wronged by weaker rulers and hostile enemies. In Hitler's imagination, history became a dramatic struggle. A great people, surrounded by enemies, betrayed by weakness, waiting for liberation. But as a young man, Hitler was not yet a political leader. He was a dreamer. He wanted to become an artist. He moved to Vienna and applied to the Academy of Fine Arts. He was rejected. Then he applied again, rejected again. For Hitler, these failures were humiliating. He believed he was destined for greatness, but the world refused to recognize him. In Vienna, he lived in poverty. He stayed in cheap rooms and shelters. He sold small paintings and postcards. He wandered the city, absorbing its politics, its racial theories, its anti-Semitism, and its harsh social divisions. Vienna was a city of culture and empire, but also a city of resentment. There, Hitler encountered ideas that would later become central to Nazi ideology: hatred of Jews, fear of Marxism, obsession with race, and belief in authoritarian leadership. Still, he remained a nobody, a failed artist, a drifting young man, one of millions who might have disappeared into history without leaving a trace. Then came 1914. The First World War changed everything. When war broke out, Hitler volunteered for the Bavarian army. For the first time in his life, he found something that gave him structure, purpose, and identity. In the trenches of the Western Front, amid mud, artillery, poison gas, and death, Hitler felt he belonged. He was no longer a rejected artist. He was a soldier, a servant of a cause, a man inside history. He served as a dispatch runner, carrying messages through dangerous conditions. He was wounded. He was temporarily blinded by a gas attack. He received the Iron Cross for bravery. To Hitler, the war gave meaning to his life. And that is why Germany's defeat in 1918 shattered him so deeply. When he heard that Germany had surrendered, he felt betrayed. The war, which had given him identity, had ended in humiliation. The nation he believed in had collapsed. From that moment, his anger hardened. He accepted the myth that Germany had been stabbed in the back. He believed the soldiers had been betrayed by civilians, politicians, Marxists, and Jews. This belief became the foundation of his political message. It allowed him to say to the German people, "You did not lose because you were weak. You lost because traitors betrayed you. You are not guilty. You are victims. And if you follow me, I will punish those responsible." This message would become one of the most dangerous weapons in modern history. After the war, Germany was filled with former soldiers who could not return easily to civilian life. Many were angry. Many felt abandoned. Many were attracted to extremist politics. Hitler remained connected to the army and was eventually assigned to observe political groups in Munich. One of those groups was small, obscure, and almost meaningless at the time. It was called the German Workers' Party. Hitler attended one of its meetings as an observer. But something happened. He heard ideas that matched his own anger: nationalism, antisemitism, hatred of communism, and rejection of Versailles. Soon, he was no longer simply observing. He was speaking. Then he was recruiting. Then he was leading. Hitler discovered his greatest talent: public speech. He was not a calm intellectual. He was not a careful statesman. He was a performer of rage. In beer halls and crowded rooms, he began slowly, almost quietly. Then his voice rose. His hands moved. His face tightened. His words became accusations, promises, warnings, and visions of rebirth. He gave people a story. Germany had been betrayed. Its enemies were everywhere. Democracy was weakness. Versailles was slavery. Communists were destroyers. Jews were enemies within. And only a national awakening could save the country. For people who felt humiliated, this was intoxicating. Hitler did not ask them to think deeply about policy. He asked them to feel anger, to feel pride, to feel hatred, to feel chosen. The German Workers' Party was soon renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Hitler gave the movement symbols, uniforms, rituals, and drama. He understood the power of visual politics. The red banners, the black swastika, the mass rallies, the marching columns, the raised arms, the torches, the drums, the uniforms. Every detail was designed to make the movement feel larger, stronger, and more inevitable than it really was. The Nazis created the SA, the stormtroopers, also known as the brown shirts. They fought communists in the streets. They intimidated opponents. They protected Nazi meetings. They turned politics into organized violence. To frighten conservatives, they looked like a force against communism. To angry young men, they looked like brotherhood. To Hitler, they were a weapon. But in 1923, Hitler became impatient. He believed the time had come to seize power by force. Inspired by Mussolini's march on Rome in Italy, he attempted his own revolution in Munich. This became known as the Beer Hall Putsch. Hitler and armed followers stormed a beer hall where Bavarian officials were gathered. He fired a shot into the ceiling and declared that the national revolution had begun. But the army and police did not join him. The coup collapsed. Shots were fired in the streets. Nazis were killed. Hitler was arrested. It seemed for a moment that his movement had ended in failure. But failure became opportunity. At his trial, Hitler turned the courtroom into a stage. He did not apologize. He attacked the Weimar Republic. He attacked Versailles. He attacked communists, Jews, and everyone he claimed had betrayed Germany. Newspapers carried his words across the country. The failed revolutionary became a national figure. He was sentenced to prison, but the sentence was light, and his conditions were comfortable. Inside Landsberg prison, he dictated a book. Its title was Mein Kampf, My Struggle. The book was long, repetitive, and filled with hatred. But it revealed Hitler's worldview clearly. He rejected democracy. He believed in racial hierarchy. He saw Jews as the ultimate enemy. He believed Germany needed a dictator. He wanted expansion in the East to create living space for the German people. Many people later dismissed the book as madness. But it was also a warning. The future was written there, and too many refused to read it seriously. When Hitler left prison, he had learned a crucial lesson. Power would not be taken through a sudden coup. Power would be taken legally, through elections, through propaganda, through alliances, through democracy itself. And once inside the system, he would destroy it. This was the new strategy. The Nazi Party was rebuilt with greater discipline. Local branches spread across Germany. Propaganda became more professional. The movement targeted workers, farmers, veterans, students, the middle class, and industrialists. To every audience, the Nazis offered a slightly different promise. To workers, they promised jobs. To farmers, protection from debt. To the middle class, stability. To industrialists, protection from communism. To nationalists, revenge against Versailles. To the young, meaning and belonging. To the angry, enemies. For a time, however, the Nazis remained a fringe movement. In the mid-1920s, Germany began to stabilize. The economy improved. Foreign loans helped recovery. Political violence decreased. When people felt secure, Hitler's message seemed less urgent. But security did not last. In 1929, the Wall Street crash triggered a global economic crisis. The Great Depression hit Germany with devastating force. Factories closed. Banks collapsed. Businesses failed. Millions became unemployed. Families who had survived hyperinflation now faced hunger and despair again. The Weimar Republic seemed helpless. Parliament was divided. Governments changed. Emergency decrees replaced normal politics. Democracy looked weak, slow, and unable to protect ordinary lives. Hitler understood the moment. He did not offer a detailed economic plan. He offered certainty. He promised work. He promised bread. He promised national revival. He promised to crush communism. He promised to tear up Versailles. He promised to make Germany proud again. And in a country drowning in fear, certainty became more powerful than truth. Nazi propaganda flooded the nation. Posters showed strength, unity, and discipline. Rallies became political theater on a massive scale. Hitler flew from city to city, presenting himself as a tireless leader sent by destiny. The Nazis mastered modern media. They used radio. They used film. They used newspapers. They used slogans simple enough to remember and emotional enough to repeat. They understood that politics in a crisis is not only about facts. It is about identity, fear, hope, belonging, and blame. Election after election, the Nazi vote increased. The party rose from the margins to become one of the largest in Germany. Then the largest. But Hitler still did not win absolute power through a majority. He needed help. And he received it from conservative elites who believed they could control him. These men disliked democracy. They feared communism. They thought Hitler's mass support could be used for their own purposes. They believed they could appoint him chancellor, surround him with experienced officials, and manipulate him. It was one of the greatest political miscalculations of the 20th century. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. He had not seized power by force. He had been invited into power. The door had been opened from the inside. When Hitler became Chancellor, Germany was still formally a democracy. There was still a parliament. There were still laws. There were still political parties. There was still a constitution. But Hitler did not intend to govern within democracy. He intended to bury it. The opportunity came quickly. In February 1933, the Reichstag building burned. A young communist was arrested. Hitler immediately presented the fire as proof of a massive communist conspiracy against Germany. Fear spread. The Nazis used the crisis to demand emergency powers. Civil liberties were suspended. Freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of the press, protection from arbitrary arrest. all weakened or destroyed. Many Germans told themselves it was temporary, a necessary response to danger, a security measure. But dictatorships often begin this way, not with the announcement that freedom is dead, but with the promise that freedom must be paused for safety. The Nazis arrested political opponents, especially communists and social democrats. Newspapers were shut down. Meetings were banned. Fear entered public life. Then came the Enabling Act. This law gave Hitler's government the power to pass laws without parliament. In effect, the Reichstag voted itself into irrelevance. Democracy still had buildings, but it no longer had power. Within months, Germany was transformed. Political parties were banned or forced to dissolve. Trade unions were destroyed. Independent organizations were absorbed into Nazi structures. State governments were brought under central control. The press was controlled. The courts were pressured. The police were politicized. The regime moved quickly because speed was part of its strategy. Opponents were not given time to organize. Institutions were not given time to resist. Society was overwhelmed. At the same time, the Nazis built a system of fear. The Gestapo, the secret police, became a symbol of terror. Informers spread through neighborhoods, workplaces, and even families. People learned to be careful with words. A joke could be dangerous. Complaint could be reported. A careless sentence could destroy a life. When citizens begin to police their own speech, dictatorship has already entered their minds. But Hitler also had a problem inside his own movement. The SA, led by Ernst Röhm, had been essential during the Nazi rise. Its brown shirts had fought in the streets and intimidated enemies. But now the SA wanted more power. Röhm spoke of a second revolution. The German army feared the SA. Industrialists feared instability. Conservative elites feared disorder. Hitler needed the army more than he needed Röhm. So he acted. In 1934, during the Night of the Long Knives, Röhm and other SA leaders were arrested and murdered. Other political enemies were killed as well. The purge proved that Hitler would destroy anyone who threatened his power. Even loyal followers. Even old comrades. Soon after, President Paul von Hindenburg died. Hitler merged the offices of President and Chancellor. He became Führer, the leader. German soldiers swore loyalty not to a constitution, not to the state, but to Adolf Hitler personally. From that moment, Germany was no longer a democracy in crisis. It was a totalitarian state, and its leader was now preparing to reshape society according to one of the most destructive ideologies ever put into practice. The Nazi regime did not only seek political control. It sought to redefine reality. It wanted to decide who belonged to the nation and who did not. At the center of Nazi hatred stood the Jews. Anti-Semitism had existed in Europe for centuries, but the Nazis turned prejudice into state policy, law, propaganda, and eventually genocide. At first, persecution moved in stages. Jewish shops were boycotted. Jewish civil servants were dismissed. Jewish professors, lawyers, doctors, artists, and journalists were pushed out of public life. Signs appeared warning Germans not to buy from Jews. Propaganda portrayed Jews as dangerous, corrupt, alien, and responsible for Germany's suffering. This was not random hatred. It was organized dehumanization. The goal was to make ordinary people stop seeing Jews as neighbors, colleagues, classmates, and citizens. To make them see Jews as a threat. Then, in 1935, came the Nuremberg Laws. These laws stripped Jews of full citizenship. They defined Jewish identity by ancestry, not just religion. They banned marriage and relationships between Jews and so-called Aryans. They turned racism into law. A person who had lived in Germany all his life could now be told he did not belong. A family that had served Germany for generations could now be treated as foreign. Children were taught racial ideology in schools. Textbooks carried Nazi ideas. Teachers repeated them. Youth organizations absorbed them. Newspapers and magazines spread grotesque images and conspiracy theories. Films and posters reinforced the message. The regime understood that if hatred is repeated often enough, surrounded by symbols, taught to children, and enforced by law, it can begin to look normal. This is one of the most terrifying lessons of Nazi Germany. Evil does not always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it arrives as paperwork, as regulations, as school lessons, as official language, as silence. In November 1938, Nazi persecution exploded into open violence. Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. Synagogues were burned. Jewish shops were smashed. Homes were attacked. Thousands of Jewish men were arrested. The streets glittered with shattered glass. The name sounds almost poetic, but the event was brutal. It marked a turning point. The message was clear. Jews had no protection. Not from the mob. Not from the police. Not from the state. The world condemned the violence. But condemnation was not enough. Many countries remained unwilling to accept large numbers of Jewish refugees. Inside Germany, many people looked away. Some supported the violence. Some feared opposing it. Some convinced themselves it was not their problem. But in a dictatorship, looking away can become a form of cooperation. The Nazis were not finished. For Hitler and his regime, isolating Jews was not the final goal. It was preparation. The next stage would require war. War would provide the cover. War would provide occupied territories. War would make mass violence easier to hide. And by the late 1930s, Hitler was ready to take Germany into war. Hitler had always hated the Treaty of Versailles. Once in power, he began to destroy it step by step. First, he rebuilt the German military. He expanded the army beyond treaty limits. He created an air force. He reintroduced conscription. These actions were open violations. But Britain and France, still haunted by the memory of the First World War, hesitated to confront him. Then Hitler took an even greater risk. In 1936, he sent German troops into the Rhineland, a region that was supposed to remain demilitarized. It was a dangerous gamble. The German army had orders to retreat if France responded militarily. But France did not act. Britain did not act. The gamble succeeded, and Hitler learned a lesson that would encourage every future risk. His enemies were afraid of war. They would protest, but they might not stop him. In 1938, Hitler turned to Austria. He demanded union between Austria and Germany. German troops entered the country. This was the Anschluss. Many Austrians welcomed them with cheers, flowers, and Nazi flags. Hitler entered Vienna as a conqueror celebrated as a liberator. To Germans, it looked like national destiny being fulfilled. Then came Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a region with a large German-speaking population. He claimed he was protecting Germans. But his ambitions were larger. At the Munich conference, Britain and France agreed to let Germany take the Sudetenland in exchange for Hitler's promise of no further expansion. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain returned home declaring peace. But Hitler had no intention of stopping. Months later, German forces occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia. Now his lie was exposed. This was not only about uniting Germans. This was conquest. The next target was Poland. This time, Britain and France promised to defend Polish independence. But Hitler believed they would hesitate again. On September 1, 1939, German forces invaded Poland. The attack was fast, coordinated, and devastating. Tanks, aircraft, artillery, and infantry moved together in a new style of warfare later known as Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Poland was overwhelmed. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Second World War had begun. For Hitler, war was not a tragic accident. It was the path he had chosen. He wanted territory, resources, empire, and racial domination. The victories came quickly at first. Denmark and Norway fell. The Netherlands and Belgium were overrun. France, one of Germany's greatest enemies in the First World War, collapsed in 1940. German troops entered Paris. For millions of Germans, Hitler seemed unstoppable. He had reversed humiliation. He had defeated old enemies. He had made Germany feared again. But the victories concealed a darker truth. The war had opened the door to crimes on a scale the world had never seen. Hitler's greatest obsession was the East. For years, he had spoken of living space, Lebensraum, for the German people. He believed Germany must expand eastward into Soviet territory. He saw the lands of Eastern Europe not as homes for millions of human beings, but as territory to be conquered, colonized, and exploited. He saw Slavic peoples as inferior. He saw Bolshevism as a mortal enemy. And he saw Jews as the center of a global conspiracy. In June 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was one of the largest military operations in history. At first, German armies advanced with breathtaking speed. Soviet forces were surrounded. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners were taken. Cities fell. The German command believed victory might come quickly. But the Soviet Union was vast. Its people endured enormous suffering. Its armies kept fighting. Its industry moved east. Its winter was merciless. And behind the front lines, the war became something even darker than conquest. It became extermination. Special killing units known as Einsatzgruppen followed the German army into occupied territories. Their mission was not ordinary combat. Their mission was murder. They rounded up Jews, communists, officials, and civilians. They carried out mass shootings in forests, fields, ravines, and villages. Men, women, and children were killed. Communities that had existed for centuries vanished in days. This was the beginning of genocide in its most direct form. But mass shootings were slow, psychologically difficult for the killers, and logistically chaotic. The Nazi regime moved toward a more organized system, what they called the final solution to the Jewish question. A cold phrase, a bureaucratic phrase, a phrase designed to hide the reality of mass murder. Across occupied Europe, Jews were forced into ghettos. They were stripped of property. They were marked, registered, isolated, and starved. Then they were deported. Trains carried them east. Families were packed into cattle cars with little air, little water, and no dignity. They arrived at camps whose names would become symbols of human evil. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, Majdanek. Some camps were for forced labor. Others were built primarily for death. People arrived and were separated. Men from women, parents from children, the elderly and sick from those selected for labor. Possessions were taken. Names were replaced by numbers. Human beings were processed as if they were cargo. The machinery of genocide required more than hatred. It required administration, train schedules, architects, engineers, guards, clerks, accountants, police, industrial companies, civil servants. This is what makes the Holocaust so terrifying. It was not only the work of madmen screaming in the streets. It was organized by offices, stamped by documents, moved by trains, protected by law, carried out by people who often saw themselves as simply doing their jobs. Meanwhile, many ordinary Germans knew fragments. Rumors circulated. Soldiers wrote home. People saw deportations. Neighbors disappeared. But knowledge came in pieces, and many chose not to assemble the pieces into the full truth. Some feared punishment. Some believed propaganda. Some benefited from stolen property. Some did not want to know. War gave them an excuse. Bombing, shortages, rationing, fear for sons at the front. Their own suffering became a shield against seeing the suffering of others. But suffering does not erase responsibility, and silence does not erase guilt. For a time, Hitler believed victory was still possible. But the war had become too large. Germany was fighting Britain, then the Soviet Union, and after December 1941, the United States. The Reich had awakened enemies with greater manpower, greater resources, and greater industrial power. In the east, the advance slowed. The attack on Moscow failed. Then came Stalingrad. The city on the Volga became a symbol. German forces entered it expecting victory. Instead, they were drawn into brutal urban warfare. Street by street, building by building, room by room, the battle consumed armies. Soviet forces surrounded the German Sixth Army. Hitler ordered them not to retreat. They froze. They starved. They ran out of ammunition. In early 1943, the German army at Stalingrad surrendered. It was a catastrophe. For the first time, many Germans began to sense that the war might not end in victory. The myth of Hitler's military genius cracked. But Hitler did not become more realistic. He became more stubborn. He blamed generals. He blamed weakness. He blamed betrayal. The same pattern that had shaped his rise now shaped his failure. Every defeat had to be someone else's fault. The war continued. In North Africa, German and Italian forces were defeated. In Italy, Mussolini's regime collapsed. In the Atlantic, German submarines lost the advantage. In the air, Allied bombers struck German cities. Hamburg burned. Dresden would later burn. Berlin was hit again and again. German civilians now experienced the terror of modern war from the sky. But even as Germany suffered, the Nazi regime continued its crimes. The deportations continued. The camps continued. Forced labor continued. Executions continued. The regime was collapsing militarily, but it did not abandon its ideological war. In fact, as defeat approached, Nazi violence often intensified. This reveals something essential about Hitler's rule. The war was not merely about territory. It was about ideology. Even when victory became impossible, destruction remained. If Hitler could not create his empire, he would drag Germany down with him. By 1944, the Allies were closing in. In June, American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces landed in Normandy. D-Day opened the Western Front. From the east, the Soviet army pushed forward relentlessly. Germany was now being crushed between two massive forces. Inside Germany, some military officers finally tried to kill Hitler. On July 20, 1944, a bomb exploded at his headquarters. Hitler survived. The failed assassination led to brutal reprisals. Thousands were arrested. Many were executed. The regime tightened its grip even as the walls closed in. Hitler presented survival as proof of destiny. But destiny was running out. By 1945, the Third Reich was dying. From the west came the Americans, British, Canadians, and their allies. From the east came the Red Army, hardened by years of brutal fighting and driven by revenge for the devastation Nazi Germany had brought to Soviet lands. German cities lay in ruins. Railways were destroyed. Factories were bombed. Refugees filled the roads. Food was scarce. Hospitals overflowed. The promise of national rebirth had ended in rubble. The propaganda machine still spoke of final victory. But almost no one believed it anymore. Hitler withdrew into the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin. Underground, surrounded by concrete, stale air, loyal aides, and military maps, he continued to issue orders. But many of the units he commanded no longer existed. Armies on the map were destroyed in reality. Divisions were reduced to fragments. Teenagers and old men were thrown into the final defense. The Hitler Youth, boys who had grown up under Nazi propaganda, were sent against Soviet tanks. The regime that had promised Germany a 1,000-year empire was now sacrificing children in the ruins of its capital. Berlin became a battlefield. Artillery thundered day and night. Buildings collapsed. Civilians hid in basements. Smoke filled the streets. The Red Army advanced block by block. Inside the bunker, Hitler's world shrank. He heard reports of betrayal. He raged against generals. He imagined counterattacks that could not happen. He blamed the German people themselves, suggesting that if they were too weak to win, they deserved destruction. This was the final truth of the Führer cult. The leader who claimed to love Germany was willing to see Germany destroyed rather than admit failure. In late April, Hitler learned that Mussolini had been captured and killed in Italy, his body publicly displayed. Hitler feared the same fate. He decided he would not be taken alive. On April 29, 1945, He married Eva Braun in a brief ceremony inside the bunker. The next day, April 30th, as Soviet forces closed in, Hitler and Eva Braun entered a private room. She took poison. He shot himself. Their bodies were carried outside and burned in the garden of the Reich Chancellery. A few days later, Berlin fell. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The Third Reich, which had promised to last 1,000 years, had survived barely 12. This legacy was not glory. It was devastation. Millions dead. Cities destroyed. Europe shattered. Germany occupied. And the full horror of the Holocaust exposed to the world. As Allied forces advanced across Europe, they discovered the camps. At first, even battle-hardened soldiers could barely understand what they were seeing. Bodies stacked like wood. Survivors reduced to skeletons. Barracks filled with disease, starvation, and silence. Warehouses of stolen belongings. Shoes, glasses, suitcases, hair. Names erased, but evidence remaining. The camps revealed the true nature of the Nazi regime. This had not been only a dictatorship, not only a war machine. It had been a system built to classify, isolate, exploit, and murder human beings on a massive scale. The Holocaust claimed the lives of 6 million Jews. Millions of others were also persecuted and killed. Roma and Sinti, disabled people, Polish civilians, Soviet prisoners of war, political opponents, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and many more. The scale of the crime forced the world to create new language. Genocide. Crimes against humanity. At Nuremberg, leading Nazis were placed on trial. For the first time, the world attempted to hold state leaders legally responsible for crimes committed under the cover of government authority. The defendants claimed they were following orders. But the court rejected the idea that obedience could erase moral responsibility. The trials established a principle. There are crimes so great that no law, no uniform, no flag, and no leader can justify them. Inside Germany, the reckoning was more complicated. Many claimed they had known nothing. Some truly knew little. Others knew enough and chose silence. Some had supported Hitler until defeat made support impossible. Some had benefited from the regime. Some had feared it. Some had resisted and paid with their lives. The question remained, how had this happened? How had a modern nation, rich in science, music, philosophy, engineering, and culture, become the center of a project of war and extermination? The answer is not simple, and that is why it matters. Because the danger of Hitler's story is not that he was a monster unlike any other human being. The danger is that he rose through human weaknesses that still exist. Fear, humiliation, hatred, conformity, ambition, silence, the desire for simple answers, the longing for a strong leader, the willingness to blame minorities, the belief that democracy is too slow, the belief that rights are obstacles, the belief that violence can restore greatness. These forces did not die in 1945. They can return in new forms under new flags using new words. Today, Germany is a very different country. Nazi symbols are banned. Holocaust denial is illegal. Students learn about the crimes of the Third Reich. Memorials stand in cities, towns, and former camps. Small stones and sidewalks carry the names of victims who once lived in ordinary homes before they were deported and murdered. These memorials are not there to trap people in the past. They are there to warn the future. Because the road to catastrophe rarely begins with camps and mass graves. It begins earlier, with words, with humiliation, with conspiracy theories, with lies repeated until they sound like truth, with the claim that one group is responsible for every problem, with attacks on journalists, with attacks on courts, with contempt for parliament, with the glorification of violence, with the idea that only one man can save the nation. Hitler did not hypnotize Germany by magic. He exploited real crises. He used economic collapse. He used fear of communism. He used resentment over Versailles. He used hatred that already existed. He used democracy's freedoms to destroy democracy itself. He told people what they wanted to hear. You are innocent. You are victims. You have been betrayed. Your enemies are inside your own country. Give me power and I will restore everything. This is one of the most dangerous political messages in the world, because it offers comfort. It removes responsibility. It turns complexity into a target. It turns citizens into followers. And once followers surrender their judgment to a leader, the path becomes dark very quickly. The story of Nazi Germany reminds us that free institutions matter. A free press matters. Independent courts matter. Opposition parties matter. Civil society matters. Elections alone are not enough. A dictatorship can rise through elections if the culture of freedom has already been weakened. Democracy is not only a system of voting. It is a system of limits. Limits on power. Limits on revenge. Limits on the leader. Limits on the anger of the crowd. When those limits are destroyed, the state can become a weapon. And when the state becomes a weapon, no one is safe. Not minorities. Not opponents. Not ordinary citizens. Not even the followers who helped build it. In the end, Hitler destroyed nearly everything he claimed to love. He promised Germany greatness. He gave it ruin. He promised unity. He gave it fear. He promised order. He gave it war. He promised rebirth. He gave it ashes. And that is why the story must be told again and again. Not because the past should imprison us, but because the past can warn us. The fall of Germany into Nazism was not inevitable. At many moments, different choices could have been made. Politicians could have refused to normalize Hitler. Conservatives could have refused to use him. Voters could have rejected hatred. Citizens could have defended democracy earlier. Institutions could have resisted more strongly. The tragedy is that by the time many understood the danger, it was too late. The laws had changed. The police had changed. The courts had changed. The army had sworn loyalty to one man. The enemies had been named. The camps had been built. The war had begun. And the nation that once thought it was choosing strength discovered that it had chosen destruction. The lesson is clear. When a leader tells a wounded people that he alone can save them, beware. When he says the law must bend to his mission, beware. When he calls opponents traitors, beware. When he turns minorities into enemies, beware. When he demands loyalty not to truth, not to country, not to constitution, but to himself, beware. Because history shows where that road can lead. It leads through cheering crowds, through burning books, through broken glass, through silent neighbors, through trains leaving at night, through cities in flames, through bunkers under the earth, and finally through ashes. The story of Hitler is not only the story of one man's evil. It is the story of what can happen when a society gives its fear a leader, its hatred a flag, and its silence a reason. And by the time the world wakes up, the cost may already be measured in millions of lives. That is why we remember. That is why we study. And that is why the warning must never be ignored.